think AT&T says we're close enough. Tap on to the first one. All right, so hi everyone. We're going to talk about molding and casting. I'm starting off with a disclaimer. I don't work for Smooth On. Just because the table's littered with their stuff, I don't work with them. I'm not affiliated with them. I just buy a lot of stuff there, and because I buy so much stuff there, they give me free stuff. So it's sort of a self-fulfilling prophecy. Related to the free stuff, at the end of the panel, I'm going to be giving this away. So stick around. It's like a $100 molding and casting starter kit from Smooth On that they donated to the panel. So it's at the end, so you all have to stay. Okay, can move on from disclaimer land. All right, so this is the simple summary of the panel. You've made a cool thing. You want more of your cool thing. How do you do it? Tap, please. You make a mold of it, and then tap again. And then you can make as many of your cool thing as you want. So it's really that easy. It's a lot of fun, and it's surprisingly accessible. You don't need special equipment. You don't really need a special place to do it. You kind of just need a drop cloth and a good corner. And we'll go through kind of the basics of making molds and making casts from your molds. So first off, we'll talk about mold making. I'm going to go over 3 different kinds of molds. There is more complexity to it than this, but this is a basic kind of intro to it. There's a 1-part box mold, which is the simplest kind out there. There's a 2-part mold, which is a little bit more complicated because you start getting into seam lines and dividers. And then there's a brush-on mold, which is what you would use for making a bigger hollow object like this. So the 1-part box is sort of the basic, beginner's molding. What you see here is a Han Solo and carbonite mold made from a vintage 1983 Kenner toy, because it was the perfect shape to use for a demo. So here we go. And tap on. So we're going to walk through the process, and I'll describe a little bit. There we have our friend Han, looking all dashing in his carbonite shell. Next. So first thing you do is you build a box. That's the box mold. Generally speaking, you want anywhere from 1/2 inch to 1 inch around your figure in every direction, because you want the outside walls to be solid enough that when you pour the resin in, it doesn't bow it out and make it distorted. I made this one really thick because this was made for demos, and random people are going to be playing with it, and I wanted it to be durable. So this one's pretty excessive. This is about 1 1/4 inches in every direction. That doesn't hurt anything. It just uses more silicone, which is expensive. So it's really the only reason to be conservative with it. So you build up your little box. I just used scrap plastic that I had laying around. A lot of people use Lego bricks. They're great for it because you can reuse them. The silicone doesn't stick to anything, so it won't damage them. So you make your box out of Legos, pour your silicone in. When you're done, pop them apart. You're good to go. In this case, I just used scrap plastic. Next. Once I build it, I ran a bead of hot glue around all the seams so it wouldn't leak, because nothing makes you sadder than pouring it in and then watching it oozing out of unfinished seams all over your counter, and you have a nice mold of your workbench. Once it's done, Han is now glued to the bottom of the box. The reason he's glued into place is you don't want him to float up, because if he's embedded in the middle of your silicone, it's also sad, because now you have a block of silicone that has a Han Solo in the middle of it somewhere. And then, so you mix it up. The goos all come in various colors. Once you get familiar with them, you kind of know them by color. This particular one is called Mold Star. The reason I like this is that it's really tough. It doesn't tear, it doesn't stretch. Some of them look like melted creamsicles. This one's kind of minty looking. Next. Then you just pour it in. That's all there is to making one of these molds. You don't have to use any kind of release. You don't have to do any divider walls. It's just simple one piece. This silicone cures pretty slowly. It takes about 12 hours to dry, so you just leave it overnight. And when you're done, you pop them out, and here you go. Now the 2-part is same idea, but it's a little bit more complicated. When you're looking at your original piece, you have to figure out where's a good logical dividing line in it. Ideally, you like to try to make your seam someplace fairly inconspicuous. Like, I've seen people do 2-part molds for a helmet, and they make a seam right down the center of the face. And I mean, you can sand it out and all, but when you're doing it, if you think, like, does it make sense to have a big dividing line right in the middle of my face? If you've got a mold that has some kind of complex pattern, like, a knurled texture or some kind of grained texture, if you put a seam right down the middle of that, you can't really sand it out because you'll destroy the texture. So that's really the hardest part of making a multi-piece mold, is figuring out where's a good safe line. If you want to tap forward, I've got a picture of, this is the box, the outside, nothing very interesting. You open it up. This was Jane Cobb's pistol from Serenity. This was actually the first mold I ever made, so it's really ugly, but it does the job. What we've got going on here is I did a center line just all around the perimeter of the gun because it was an easy place to do it, and they're all smooth surfaces, so they're pretty easy to sand out. And then you've got these little bumps around here, which are keys. If you tap to the next slide, you can see they go into slots in the other half of the mold. That way your two pieces stay properly registered and you get a nice consistent piece with no warping and no weird distorted lines. Now, knowing what I know now, this was an amazingly inelegant way to do the tabs. It's a lot easier when you make your clay divider between the two halves. Just take the end of a pencil and push it into the clay. It makes nice little nubs that are a lot prettier looking than that, but at the time I wasn't really thinking of how it looked. Go on to the next one. And then the last type that I'm talking about is the brush on, where if you have something like this, putting this in a box isn't very practical. It's huge, you use a ton of silicone. So you use a thicker kind that you paint on, and you do multiple layers of it. Once the silicone cures, you can peel it off in one piece like a glove and produce a cast like this with no seams on it. Go to the next. And this is a quick video of a basically time-lapse photography of making a mold. Tap again to start. And what you get here is a process that takes about 2 days start to finish, condensed down to about 3 minutes. So you mix up, part A and part B of your silicone. This is the stuff I mentioned before. It looks kind of like a creamsicle. It's not very tasty in reality, but it looks like it should be. And first coat is the most important. That's where you get all of your detail. If you have a bubble in the first coat, no matter what you do, it's going to be ruined. So you want to be really careful on the first coat. Make sure no hairs fall out of the brush. Make sure that you don't have any dust or specks. I've even seen fingerprints come through, so you want to make sure it's nice and clean and smooth. Once you get past the first coat, you can kind of glop it on as thick and sloppy as you want because it doesn't matter much from there. So you see I just spent some time going through, paint it all on, and second coat I'm just pouring it on the top and spreading it around because you're really just trying to build up thickness. People have varying opinions on it. You say at least 1/4 of an inch thick. I like to go a lot thicker than that because I do a lot of casts out of the mold. The thicker the silicone is, the stronger it'll be. So I usually go for more like 3/8 inch thick. Again, it's really just a question of the cost of the material. You can see the silicone I'm spreading in here is thicker. It's more like peanut butter. That's actually the same stuff, but it's got an additive put in that makes it more pasty. So you can pack it into indents, undercuts, sort of helps you build it up a little bit. Then from there we do another coat just to smooth it out because you want the outside finish to be relatively nice because we're going to build a shell around it later and you don't want the shell to get stuck on any lumps or bumps. So here I'm giving it an awesome punk rock mohawk. Doing a dividing line because the shell that we're going to build is a 2-piece that will snap together. So building in that seam will let me separate the 2 halves and not have to worry about them overlapping and putting some kind of mold release on it. I skipped the last coat because you've seen enough now. I've already done 5. Why do you need to see number 6? The plastic paste is a rigid shell that goes around the mold and helps it keep its shape when you're casting. The silicone will be squishy, so if you tried to pick it up and fill it with resin and slosh it around, you get a warped, weird shape. So the rigid shell will help it to hold its form and protect it while you're doing the casting. And just like everything else, you mix up 2 parts, spread it on. This stuff dries in 10 minutes, so it's pretty quick. And all of this stuff is relatively odor-free. The smell is about as offensive as latex house paint when it's drying, so some people might find it problematic, but for the most part, it's perfectly fine to do in your kitchen table, as long as you have a drop cloth down or you don't like your kitchen table. So you did one side of the shell, just trimming it off clean. Otherwise, you'll stab yourself pretty badly when you're casting it. So the cleaning up has no functional purpose. Tinfoil is, people always get surprised by that, but it's really good for this. It lets you separate the 2 halves so they don't stick to each other when you're making it. It's cheap, just about everybody has it around the house. And there's no chemical residue, no stuff stuck to your hand or the mold. Just a nice, clean, and easy way to do it cheaply. And so that's basically the process of making a glove mold. That one it's kind of challenging to get it right the first time, just because you need to make sure it's thick enough to support its own shape. Tap on. So that brings us to casting. And just like with the 3 types of molds, we've got different kinds of casting. I'm just going to move on to simple poured cast. Oh, I don't know my own slides. So resins. There are all different kinds of resins that you can get, and they're usually, the defining factors are how long they stay liquid in the bucket, how long it takes for them to solidify, and how hard they are when they solidify. And you want to use different materials for different things. Like the material I use for these helmets is not as hard as some of the others, so that it's relatively impact resistant. If you drop something like this, you don't want it to shatter into a million pieces. So this material has a little bit of flex to it. You can see I can kind of squish in the inside without it breaking. That way, if a trooper bumps into something, walks head first into a doorway, whatever, their head isn't going to come flying apart. This stuff I'm using here is much faster curing and much more rigid. This is great for a little one piece like our friend Captain Solo. So for this part of it, we're actually going to make a cast of Captain Solo. The stuff dries very quickly, so we can just do one live up in the room. Volunteer. Who would like to come up and make the cast? I think you went up first.
Cool.
Come on up, Doctor.
I'll leave the goggles on.
You're also in a lab coat, so it's perfect. All right, so gloves for you. And this is very simple. If you can pour liquid into a cup without spilling it, you're good to go.
I can do that. I'm not trying to put on the glove. Right.
We're going to use 1 ounce of each of these.
Okay.
So
and this is by volume.
Yep.
Does it ever go by weight?
Some of them do. They vary depending on the product. I like to use the ones that go by volume because it's easy.
Okay. That is milliliters.
If something goes by weight, obviously you need a scale. These ones are pretty easy. If it's slightly off, it doesn't really matter a whole lot.
Yep.
So you're able to just sort of mix it up and go. This one, you want to add 1 ounce of the yellow to that.
1 ounce of the yellow. No, shake well before using. Whoops.
I already shook it.
Okay, good.
We are prepared. They all say shake well before using. What I usually do is I shake them up about 10 minutes before I'm actually going to use, because then that way the bubbles have time to settle a little bit.
No, that's good.
He's measuring.
That should be good. You're going to just stir it up with that conveniently located stick. And it doesn't take a whole lot. There, as you can see from him stirring, it's a very thin liquid. It's not making him pass out from odor, so that's a good sign. Once you feel like it's well stirred, just pour it into Captain Solo. And reach over here. I believe this stuff cures in 10 minutes. So once that has filled up the mold, we'll just let it sit, and 10 minutes later, we'll pop out another Captain Solo.
Beautiful.
And for your assistance, you can take home this lovely souvenir Captain Solo.
Thank you.
1 point of trivia on this guy. The silver is not painted. That is a metallic powder that was painted into the mold before casting. So he's actually cast in silver, and there's just a little black wash on it.
Awesome.
You can see some residue of the silver powder on there. So
that one will come out clear?
That one will come out this color. It'll turn white as it cures.
Cool.
And that's one of the neat things about it. You can tell it's cured by the fact that it turns white.
All right.
So thank you for your assistance.
Thank you.
Enjoy your lovely Captain Solo. Move on to the next one. So 2-part mold. That is the gun that we saw earlier. When Serenity came out, I had done a Jane Cobb costume, and I wanted his sidearm. So I looked around a little bit, couldn't find a kit anywhere, so did some research, figured out what it was, bought an airsoft gun, sculpted up all the pieces, made this mold, and produced those casts. That was my first introduction to ever doing any of this stuff. I bought one of those boxes of here's everything you need to start learning molding and casting, and tried it. The first one was a horrific failure. I threw that away. Second one wasn't much better, but it kind of sort of worked. Third mold came out okay and did that. There is a lot of learning curve when you first start on it, and unfortunately you kind of just have to accept that you are going to goof up here and there, and there will be a bit of waste, but it is an unfortunate side effect of learning anything new, so you just got to kind of roll with it. On to the next one. So slush casting. This is the most interesting one to me. One of the things people always ask us is, how do you make the helmets hollow? And people think, you know, do you put a plug in? Do you drill it out? No, we actually do it the most primitive way you can imagine. You take your mold, you pour a little bit of resin in, and you go. You do that for 5 minutes or so, pour some more resin in. 35 minutes of that later, you get one of these. So when you see a bunch of troopers walking around somewhere, you can say, wow, I know how long you took to make those hats. Move on to the next. So this picture here is one day of work. We did a group build project at my house where we had a bunch of fellow 501st members from Pennsylvania drove out to our house, and I gave them a crash course in molding, casting, and vacuum forming, and then set them out to see how much stuff they could make in a day. 15 helmets, 12 rifles, and 6 pistols later, we went through 8 gallons of resin, and we had 2 people who were in a room for about 15 hours, just going, make it stop, please make it stop. But, you know, it doesn't take long to pick up on it, and once you get going on it, it's really fun, and it gets strangely addictive. You start looking at things, I could do that, I could do that, I could make that. It's just a little side note here. For the people who can actually see it, you can see that the core of our little Han here is all white now, and there's just a little bit of clear around the edges. And he's also throwing off a fair bit of heat. One thing that's important to note, especially us in the colder climates, this stuff is all very temperature sensitive. They cure by an exothermic reaction, so they produce and release a lot of heat as they go. Silicones in particular are very sensitive to temperature. If it's below 65 degrees Fahrenheit, your silicone won't cure. Resins are less sensitive, but if you get much colder than that, they cure a lot slower. So if the listed time is 10 minutes and it's in a cool room, it might take 30 minutes for it to cure. So ideally, you want to work in a warm space where things can do what they're supposed to do naturally. Yes?
Is there too hot to cure?
No, it cures faster, so you have to be aware of that. You know, in the summertime, when we're making these helmets, normally this resin takes 5 to 7 minutes for the first coat to cure, and then subsequent coats, as you're adding them, go faster and faster as the heat builds up inside the helmet. In the summertime, when it's really warm, sometimes we'll get 2 or 3 minutes, so you have to slush very, very fast. But in general, heat is better for it. Some people even have hot boxes that they've made for their molds where they pour the silicone, put it in a box, and then cook it to make it go faster.
Is humidity ever a problem?
Not too much. This stuff isn't very sensitive to that. Painting is much more sensitive to it, but the actual casting doesn't really care. No, that's it. Yes?
What about outgassing? Or do you need to vac these things out to get bubbles out? Or?
Not really. Most of the smooth-on products are designed to not require any sort of pressure chambers or degassing. If one of the products needs it, it'll tell you. But most of them are this is really meant for hobbyist stuff in a lot of ways, so it's designed for people who don't have special equipment, which is why I got started using those products, because it was easy and accessible. So,
if you want to put colors, like you put the silver powder, you can put powder in the resin, and instead of being white, it's going to be whatever color.
yeah, they actually, there are pigments that are designed just for that. The little honsicle that he has, the resin was tinted gray before I added the silver powder. This charming pearlescent Han Solo was one where I forgot to add the black pigment to him. He was supposed to come out silver, but instead he came out more shiny pearl color because of that. So between the mix of the colors and the metallic powders, you can get a lot of finishes without having to paint anything, which is always nice because then it doesn't scratch up.
I've got a question about the multiple layers. The non-cured resin stick to cured resin?
As long as you don't let it fully dry. So when the resin is curing, it starts off, it gets a little bit tacky. It'll still stick to the sides and not drip, but it's still a little bit sticky. When you add more layers in at that stage, it fuses and doesn't come apart. If you let it fully cure and then try to add another layer, they'll delaminate unless you sand the inside of it down really well. So it's always recommended when you're starting one of these projects, you really want to do it in one shot, which is difficult with the silicone molding because the layers take about an hour between each one to dry. So if you're making a 6-layer mold, you really have to be able to set aside an entire day just dedicated to going back to it and sort of chipping away. What I'll usually do is I'll save those for Saturday. I'll get up in the morning, do a coat of silicone, have breakfast, do whatever I have to do another one, do some errands, come home, do another one. By the end of the night, it's done. So that is the sort of basic overview of all of this stuff. Let's see, is Han? Looks like Han is probably good to go.
How do you demold one of the helmets? Do you remove the hard shell, or?
You pop apart the hard shell. Usually the two halves will be bolted together. So you pop the two parts, and then the silicone will just peel back. So you don't have to have any seams or anything in there. It'll just peel off nice and sort of glove-like. Hence the term glove mold. So this Han, I got a little bit impulsive. I demolded him a bit too fast. So you can see he's still squishy.
Whoa.
So this can actually be good in some contexts. I recently saw someone who was working on an armored costume, and there was an armband that wrapped around. He was trying to figure out how he was going to cast that. He ended up doing a flat cast, intentionally demolded it too soon, and wrapped it around a piece of PVC pipe while it was still soft. Let it cure that way, and then it held that shape forever. So he was able to make a round armband hollow mold, and everyone would look at it and go, how did you cast that? He was like, oh no, trade secret. And then he tells everybody, no, I just bent it. So unfortunately, Mr. Solo there was victim to me being impatient. But let's mix up another Captain Solo since he got trashed.
I think you needed another 4 minutes or so.
Yeah, I do that a lot. I get impulsive and I pull things out of their molds. I paint them too fast. I tend to do everything kind of like a hyperactive ferret. And sometimes it serves me well and sometimes it just makes a mess of things. Thankfully, since he's a very small mold with very little impact, it's not anything I'll be too sad about.
What are the deciding factors in whether to color the material ahead of time or paint that?
It depends on what I'm doing with it. Anytime you can color it before you cast, it's great because paint will inevitably chip, especially if it's something that's going to get handled a lot. So if you can tint it to at least something close to the color you want, like a lot of times when we're doing something like a weapon, it's nice to tint the resin to be silver, and then you paint it so when it chips, it actually looks like real damage. You can't always get a perfect color match, but at least if you can get close. Other things like if you see the inside of this helmet is gray, that's actually because when we're wearing them, light comes in through the visors. If the inside is dark, it doesn't reflect around in your face as much, so it helps to keep things sort of hidden inside. So it's really just kind of context sensitive. I mean, these helmets end up getting painted white, so it makes sense to keep them white. But if this was going to be painted all black or all blue or something, I'd probably pigment it first. The other thing we'll do, similar to the weapons, we'll make helmets silver so that when they get chipped, they look all battle damaged and cool.
Yeah, I'm not sure if you covered this, I got late, but what about with if you want to make some softer material like rubber uses silicone?
So basically silicone doesn't stick to anything but other silicone. So if you wanted to make like a superhero cowl or a mask or something, or like a urethane rubber, you could pour that into a silicone mold and it would be the same process. The one thing you can't do is cast silicone into other silicone, so it'll just fuse to itself. So generally speaking, people will do a silicone mold and then a urethane cast for like a little superhero type mask. I don't do a lot of that myself. I was actually just talking with a friend who does. He uses mostly urethane because it's significantly cheaper than silicone and it's easier to work with. So he finds it's a good trade-off. Most people don't need a mask that can be stretched to 10 times its size before it tears. So the advantage of silicone isn't really there.
Well, my father said maybe this is bullshit, but
You can make the molds out of plaster.
Okay, and then just have to destroy it.
Yep. And it depends, a lot of it depends on how many you're planning on doing. Like, I do a lot of copies. We've done, from this clone helmet mold, we've probably done about 150 helmets. So we really want to make sure that it's durable because we don't want to be remaking it every time. If it was a one-off, you can definitely do plaster. If you're planning on casting something in latex, plaster is a really good base because it helps make the latex dry better.
But
But that's also sort of the other benefit too. If you build a mold out of urethane, you don't get the same library life, by which we mean if you put the damn mold on the shelf, in a few years it's going to have shrunk. It's going to be less pliable. It may crack, it may fail to stretch, and ultimately you're not going to get a good cast. Whereas silicone, the amount of time you have before that process really happens to detriment your casting is significantly longer. And then you can go either with tin or cured silicones, which are cheaper but have a slightly shorter library life than say platinum cured silicones, which are more expensive, a little harder to work with because they tend not to be one-to-one and they tend to be by mass rather than by volume. But they have significantly longer library lives than frequent paint nails.
And that's actually a good segue into this. So this kit that we have to give out includes a platinum cure silicone, which is 1:1 by volume. So it's the best of both worlds.
Isn't that one food grade too?
No, this one is not food
Okay,
grade.
so I've heard the platinum is what you use for food.
There's, it is a platinum cure silicone, but there's, in smooth-on terms, it's the Sil something 940.
Okay.
Which actually my next project that I'm planning on doing is I'm making another Han Solo mold out of food grade silicone so I can make Han Solo chocolate bars.
I'm planning on making Legos and then building stuff out of gummy Legos.
Oh, nice, tasty Legos.
Yeah, gummy Legos, yeah.
So this kit here has, what does it have in it? It's got the silicone, it's got the mold release wax, it's got the thickener, it's got the plasti paste shell material, it's got the casting resin, instructional DVD, a book, and pretty much all you need to buy are rubber gloves and mixing cups. So I didn't really think about how I was going to pick someone to get this. So let's start off with, who is here from outside of New England? Who here is outside of the East Coast?
I think we're considered central.
I don't know. How about outside of US?
Yeah.
I think outside of US probably trumps outside of this coast. So did you come here from?
Israel.
You came from Israel.
Oh, that's cool.
Will you be able to bring this back with you to Israel?
Yes.
Congratulations. You win for being the most dedicated Arisia goer ever. Very impressive. So that is everything you need to get started to play around with the stuff. It's basically got this size containers of all the various things we talked about in here. It's enough to make a fairly decent sized mold. You wouldn't make a helmet mold out of something that big, but if you had an object maybe yay big or so, it'd be the perfect stuff for that. So congratulations. Does anyone have any other questions or stuff you're curious about, or?
So when you do the helmet that's got like multi-colors, do you do like I guess you would do the first layer in white and then so you just have 2 sets of resin?
Well, this one is, these helmets are made up of 5 coats of resin. So we start off with 1 white coat, and then it can be helpful to tint your different layers differently, because then you can see if you've got even coverage. So you do a white coat and then put a couple of drops of black in for the next coat, and then maybe a middle coat, you could put a drop of blue in it to see, because you're never going to see those from the outside, but then that way, as you're casting each layer, you can tell whether or not you're doing a good job of it. And then I always finish off with something in a spectrum of gray to black. It just depends on how much I happen to drop in that time. Sometimes they come out really dark, sometimes they come out really light. You can actually pass this around so that people can see sort of the weight of it and how they feel. And then on this side, I can pass around the Hans that aren't sticky.
For seeing through the helmet, do you cut it? What do you cut it with?
Any variety of Dremel blades. I really love Dremels. I have 2 that I use regularly in projects simultaneously. Every sort of cutting bit humanity can think of, diamond saws and drills and fiberglass wheels. Mostly for cutting out the visors, I use either the fiberglass wheels or little diamond saws. And then we glue in a dark welding shield inside the face to make up the visor.
When you were making Jane's gun, did you have a problem filling in the area where the trigger arch was?
Actually, that is part of the base Colt. The pistol that it was based on, the Colt 1911, that trigger is exactly stock. So that one, what I did for that Jane gun is I had figured out that it was a Colt 1911, and I found an airsoft one that had the right features on it, and used that as the base and then sculpted up the pieces that they added. The trigger looks like it would have been difficult, but thankfully I didn't have to deal with that. It was awesome.
What's the name of that kit? I saw you talking about fast storage.
That is from Smooth On is the company. I've actually got catalogs and flyers and stuff that they gave me from the store. They have a retail store in Brighton, which is really helpful. Yep.
They're really great over there.
Yeah, everyone who works there is actually in some way a sculptor, caster, something. And they gave me all the stuff because I'm a regular customer and they just like to support things like this. I mean, obviously it's good promotion for them, but it was very cool to be able to have this stuff. I really, I've been shopping at that store for about 5 years now, and my experience has been if you call Smooth On for customer service, they're terrible because they just have a call center of people who don't necessarily know what they're doing. Whereas if you call the Reynolds store, you actually get someone who knows what they're doing. So it's a nice thing. Once we're wrapped up here, we've actually got magazines. These are like just a sort of different projects people have done, which is cool to flip through. And we've also got product catalogs that all have their sticker on it. That was basically the trade-off. Like, here, I'll give you free stuff to give away if you put these out on your table. So I was like, all right, I don't think anyone's going to complain about a little bit of an infomercial if they get a $100 resin kit for free.
So for your cast materials, you're going to go to paint it like a temperature paint, such as a metal chrome or something like that. Would that change the?
That stuff does not deal with high heat well at all. It will warp under. Even leaving it in your attic or a hot car for too long can cause it to warp. So they don't fare well with like vacuum metallizing or chroming or anything like that. Fiberglass. I hate working with fiberglass, but it's much more durable for things like that. I do anything in my power to stay away from fiberglass resin, but sometimes you just can't help it.
Or rub and buff.
Rub and Buff does do a nice metallic finish, just not chromy. Yes.
I've heard it said that when your copy of your whole thing comes out in the mold, that at that point you're about halfway done. And you talked a little bit about smoothing out the seams and sanding and whatnot, but
yes. So for the most part, you'll always get some minor bubbles and imperfections in your castings. It's just sort of inevitable. So typically when you pull it out, you've got rough edges. Like if you look at the back of those Han Solos, you can see the back has a little bit of lip around the edges. And so you want to sand off the edges. You want to stick to fairly gentle sandpapers. My wife makes fun of me a lot because she comes from a construction-based family, and to them, 80 grit sandpaper is very smooth. To me, I consider 120 really, really coarse. That's like the rough stuff that I use to start off, and then I go all the way down to 1,000 wet sanding to get the really fine finish. But yeah, when you pull the cast out, you are about halfway there. Like that clone helmet that's being passed around will probably take me another 4 hours or so to finish up. And actually, it's a lot less than halfway there, because it took me about 35 minutes to make, and it'll take about 4 hours to finish from here.
So that's what it looks like straight out of the mold.
Yep, that is, the only thing I've done with that is around the bottom edge, when you first cast it, there's just little bits of resin that sort of dripped out and are hanging around. I clipped those off just so that they didn't break and fall off on someone. But otherwise, that's straight out of the cast, no cleanup, just here's the helmet. Anyone else have anything?
In terms of casting the object that you're going to mold, the silicon can handle oil-based clays or wood-based clays is the preferred one.
The big thing is you want to use a clay that does not have phosphorus in it. Sorry, not phosphorus, sulfur. Sulfur-based clays will inhibit the cure. So as long as you're using a clay that does not have sulfur in it, you're
Plastilina is usually one of the better stuff to use. It's very easy to sculpt with. You can warm it just by kneading it in your hands or sticking it in the microwave for a couple of minutes, and it will hold its shape very well once you try to actually mold it.
One of the other things I've learned the hard way is if the master that you're making a mold of has been spray painted, you want to make sure that the spray paint is done outgassing before you try to mold it. I made this mistake once on a helmet mold. I had put a coat of primer down on the original just to make sure it was smooth and even. Tried to make the mold the next day, and the silicone that was touching the helmet never cured. So I peeled it back, and there was a sticky, gooey slime all over my original and a wasted mold. So, for a sense of the cost, the silicone used to make that helmet mold was about $175, which went in the trash. And then I bought another $175 bucket of silicone and tried it again. So I've never made that mistake a second time. I always let my paints cure, my resins cure, everything is, if the label says, allow 7 to 10 days to fully cure, I actually do it. As you saw here with Han, I'm very impatient, but sometimes you have to actually do what they tell you. Yes?
Now, if Han's going to finish curing, you can always pull from the mold?
Yes, he will. He's taken damage now, so if you look at him up close, like he's cured now, but his face is caved in, because when I popped him out, he wasn't solid yet, and as a result, he face planted and poor Han, he had a rough day. Yes.
I know that there are some techniques for doing like that you would take something and you would dip it in the resin, and then you would hack it, and it would slowly drip.
That's a similar idea to the brush on. You would just, depend on the shape of the piece. The things that I'm working with are never really very conducive to that. If you had a small piece, you could mix something up in the bucket and just dip it in like you're saying, but it would really depend on the size and the shape of what you were working with, whether or not that would be practical. If you were doing a dip like that, you'd have to mix up a lot more silicone than you would use for brushing on, and there'd be waste, and it is a pretty expensive material, so usually you don't want to go down that road unless, unless you don't mind just, if it was a commercial venture and, you just had to get it done fast, some places might not mind, like, oh, I'm gonna throw away a bucket of silicone, whatever, it's done. But I'm cheap.
You do that with liquid latex, a lot cheaper.
Mm-hmm. Yes.
How do you fix a bubble? You pour it, pull down the hole, and you discover there's a bubble. Tap the nose into the
It depends on how big it is. My favorite material is plumber's epoxy putty. You get it in the plumbing aisle at Home Depot. It's a little tube you just cut off a slice and mix it up in your fingers. You can shape it, sculpt it, do whatever with it, and it cures in about 5 minutes, so it's very fast acting. It'll stick to just about anything. Just spread some in and shape it out. Or if you've got a bunch of little dimples all throughout, you can use like auto body filler, Bondo. I use wood putty sometimes, like a water-based wood putty. Yep. Pretty much anything will stick to it once it's cured. It's a very easy material to work with. Anyone else have anything you're interested in? Yes.
So in terms of making something with metallic, what are your tips?
My favorite thing, continuing on the Smooth On product line, they're Cast Magic powders. It's a finely ground metallic dust that you brush into the mold before you pour the resin in. And once it hits the resin, it cures into the surface. So you can get them, I think they have like 10 or so different colors of powder. And then depending on the tints you use in the resin behind it, they have a whole chart on their website of if you mix this color resin with this powder, you get this finish. So you can get bronze, brass, pewter. The only thing you really can't get out of it is a highly polished chrome type look. If you want something like that, the closest I've been able to come is Rub and Buff, which it will get reflective, but it's still not mirror finish. It's shiny bare metal, but I've yet to find an affordable way to get an actual mirror finish metallic on anything. If you want to go down that road, there's vacuum metallizing, and then that gets into what we were talking about earlier, where resins don't handle high heat well, so you have to shift over to fiberglass as your original. One of my friends has a C-3PO costume from Star Wars, and the entire suit has been gold chromed. And I think he paid something like $2,500 to have the suit chromed, and he has to redo parts of it every few months. So if you want to be that shiny, it gets really, really expensive. Yes.
You said in your previous talk you had the presentations up on where?
Stormtrooperguy.com. It's easy to remember. I used to have a much more obscure thing, but one of my coworkers used to just refer to me as the Stormtrooper guy at work, so I latched onto that and I registered stormtrooperguy.com. So they'll be on YouTube and they'll be linked from my website. I'll have both the slideshows and the video of what we've been doing, assuming the videos actually come out okay.
Lucas Interactive hasn't sent you a cease and desist over that?
Actually, that's a funny thing. We work very closely with Lucasfilm. They are very intimately aware of everything we do, even to the point of being personally aware of the individuals who make things. I did a presentation at Star Wars Celebration in Orlando about costuming from the Clone Wars animated series. And the executive producer of the show, Dave Filoni, came up as part of the panel. And we were talking to him. My friend Bob and I went to say something. He goes, "Oh no, I follow you guys on Facebook. I see all the stuff you do." So I had this simultaneous reaction of, "Wow, that's awesome. The producer of the show is watching." Wait, the producer of the show is watching me.
Excuse me, but how much are you going to pay me when you want some of my ideas?
Well, that's one of the things that makes, one of the reasons why Star Wars costuming is so big is because Lucasfilm is so friendly towards it. They really encourage it and support it. So the agreement that the 501st has with them is we are allowed to use their intellectual property as long as we don't sell things at a profit. So like that huge run of armor that I did, like I priced out all the components and I said to the guys who were coming up, it's going to be, I think it came out to like $250 for the body armor, the helmet, and the weapon. I was like, the cost is $250, so get me the money, I'll buy all the materials, you guys come up and we'll make them. So, I didn't make anything off of it, so that's perfectly within Lucasfilm's rules. So they see it and they're like, "Oh wow, this is great." We actually, one of the projects we did, we built a full-size Jabba the Hutt puppet that was actually featured on StarWars.com.
He was here a few years ago.
Yeah, we brought him to Arisia a couple of years ago, but we built it and someone from the StarWars.com site team saw it and they're like, "Oh, this is great." So I got an email from a friend like, "Hey, your garage is on StarWars.com right now." So we have a very good symbiotic relationship with them, which lets us do things like this, even to the point where now they've started providing us reference material to make it easier. So the people from the Clone Wars crew will actually, be like, "So, you guys didn't get this from me, but here's the 3D model that we used for the clone trooper. If your costumes suddenly get better, we won't ask why." So it's a very fun relationship, and it's a great thing to be part of. And that's, we were talking about this a couple nights ago, that you see the fandoms where the franchises are supportive of it thrive because they don't have anything to worry about. They don't have to worry about their fan sites being taken down or cease and desist letters. They get encouragement, and then Lucasfilm gets a ton of free advertising from us. And pretty much anytime you've seen a Stormtrooper on any TV commercial, expo, convention, anything, it's been someone from the 501st. So they get free troopers whenever they need them. So it works out well for everybody.
You mentioned computer models. Have you looked into doing the 3D printing rabbit prototyping?
A little bit. There are two factors to it. One, I'm cheap, and it's very, very expensive to have something that large.
Oh, not that large. Small cell.
And two, my original background was an art school kid turned IT nerd later in life. So I enjoy the process of actually sculpting things by hand. Yeah. The original sculpt for that helmet, I barely even used a ruler on it. It's all just shaped by eye. So if you look at it really closely, you'll see there are a lot of symmetry issues and things that aren't quite right, but it's perfectly passable by eye, and considering it was formed by hand, I'm pretty happy with it. That is the 5th iteration of the sculpt, though. Yeah. As the show has progressed, I've seen new details, and I'll go back, and it's one of those things where I'm never done tinkering with it. But what's nice about it, and sort of ties nicely back into what we've been talking about, so I did the original, I made a mold of it, did the helmet cast, and I decided there were things I didn't like. So I went to one of the casts, cut that up, fixed it, changed it, improved it, made a new mold.
We can build it.
Go on, make another cast, cut it up, make a new mold. So I've got this whole family history of them.
Yes.
Do you get a substantial shrink when you cast from something you make a
No.
mold from a previous cast?
The shrinkage on these materials, it's somewhere in the 20% shrinkage or something, so it's, in the various generations, it hasn't had any detrimental effect. And also, I'm cutting them up and changing them so much from time to time that I probably wouldn't even notice it. Like, this has almost no shared components with its ancestors anymore. But it's nice to be able to go back, and rather than cutting up my original every time, it's nice to go back and see all 5 of them side by side. I've been working on that particular project since September of 2008 in some form or another, just going back to it over and over and over again. And at this point in New England, I think we have about 15 clones either finished or in process. So we're growing our numbers based on all this work. And that's one of the most exciting things for me is when I cast something, seeing a person I've never met with something that I made is just so exciting. Like, I had a 501st member who was in the military, who was stationed in Djibouti, who had one of my helmets there on the base. I'm like, they've had a helmet in Djibouti? That's awesome. So I've been trying to map out the things that I've made and where they've traveled over the world, and it's really exciting to see, you do this thing and you can share it with anyone who's interested in it, which is just fun. So if anyone is interested in this stuff, you can come up and grab, we've got little pamphlets about silicones and resins, and there aren't many of these, but this magazine is really cool because it's all just projects that people have made over time. I haven't, but I've been curious about it. Well, I've always referred to him as the Han Solo. So
see, there you go. It would make a great gummy. It would also make a big chocolate.
Or how about if you're gonna make a
yeah,
it's stuff.
Would anyone else like a little Han Solo? Would you like a white one or a pretty?